at dissecting the diverse manifestations of populism across the world. Following the successful conclusion of our 8th session, Mapping European Populism panels, we have embarked on a journey to explore populism beyond the confines of Europe by expanding our panel series to encompass a global perspective, aptly titled Mapping Global Populism. Our objective is to construct a comprehensive understanding of populism worldwide, featuring monthly sessions. Today, we'll have our 14th session of the Mapping Global Populism panel series. This session is titled Tracing the Pathways of Autocracy and Authoritarianism Across Central Asia. As a testament to our commitment to knowledge dissemination, we're going to write a panel report and share the video recording of this panel on our website and YouTube channel. These resources serve as invaluable references for scholars, policymakers, and a wider audience concerned about the contemporary challenges to a global democracy posed by populist and authoritarian politics. In the ongoing journey of our panel series, we also extend our gratitude to all scholars and experts who contribute their extensive insights. With this, we would like to introduce our esteemed moderator and distinguished panelists for today's intriguing discussion. Today, our panel is going to be moderated by Dr. David Lewis, who is a professor of politics at the University of Exeter. He teaches and conducts research.
Gelebilirsin.
I'm sorry?
Sorry.
I'm sorry, what happened? Should I continue?
Just carry on.
Thank you. Today, our panel is moderated by Dr. David Lewis, who is a professor of politics at the University of Exeter. He teaches and conducts research on international relations and peace and conflict studies, with a focus on the politics of authoritarian states. His regional research primarily covers post-Soviet politics, particularly in Russia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. From 2019 to 2022, he was on a secondment as an ESRC AHRC Fellow at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in London. He's also a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London and was awarded an OBE in the newer Honours List in 2023. Dr. Lewis completed his PhD in the Department of Government at the London School of Economics and subsequently worked in political risk analysis in the private sector. He also spent several years with the Brussels-based think tank, the International Crisis Group, focusing on research programs in Central Asia and South Asia. Before joining the University of Exeter in September 2013, he was a senior lecturer in the Department of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford. Dr. Oksana Ismailbekova will be our first speaker, presenting on the topic Clean Politics, Kyrgyzstan Between Informal Governance and Democracy. Dr. Ismailbekova is a research fellow at Leibniz Centrum Modern Orient. Her research work focuses on kinship, ethnicity, patronage, conflict, and gender in Kyrgyzstan. Dr. Ismailbekova completed her dissertation at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, Halle, Germany. Based on her PhD dissertation, she wrote her monograph Blood Ties in the Native Son, Politics of Patronage in Kyrgyzstan, which was published by Indiana University in 2017. She has also been a collaborator of the Basel Institute of Governance on 2 research projects, Informal Governance or Corruption, which was funded by the British Academy Anti-Corruption Evidence Program, and the Harnessing Informality, funded by the Global Integrity Anti-Corruption Evidence Program. Our second speaker will be Dr. Denisa Duvanova, presenting on the topic Autocracy's Past and Present in Kazakhstan. Dr. Duvanova is an associate professor in international relations at Lehigh University. She received her PhD from the Ohio State University. Her research focuses on the political economy, bureaucratic politics, interest group politics, and technology-enabled forms of political participation in Russia, in Eastern Europe, and also in Central Asia. Her book, Building Business in Post-Communist Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia, was awarded the Hewitt Prize for Outstanding Publication on the Political Economy of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe. Dr. Diana Kudaibergenova will be our third speaker, discussing nationalizing authoritarianism in Uzbekistan. Dr. Kudaibergenova studies different intersections of power relations through the realms of political sociology, dealing with concepts of state, nationalizing regimes, and ideologies. Dr. Kudaibergenova received a PhD in 2015 from the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge. Her first book, Rewriting the Nation in Modern Kazakh Literature, deals with the study of nationalism, modernization, and cultural development in modern Kazakhstan. Her second book, Towards Nationalizing Regimes, Conceptualizing Power and Identity in the Post-Soviet Realm, focuses on the right of nationalizing regimes in post-Soviet space after 1991, with our prime focus on power struggles among political and cultural elites in a democratic and non-democratic states. Our final speaker is Ogulja Yazlieva, who is a PhD researcher in International Area Studies at the Department of Russian and Eastern European Studies of the Institute of International Studies, Faculty of Social Sciences at Charles University. Her research interest is Central Asian studies, focusing on Turkmenistan, mass media, education policy, languages, and translation. Previously, she was the director of the RFE-RL's Turkmen service, based in Prague, the Czech Republic. She worked at the Turkmen State University as Vice Dean of the Faculty of Law and International Relations. She was the Dean of the Faculty of International Business and Management and the Chair of the Department of Foreign Languages at Turkmen State University, Turkmenistan. Dr. Yazlieva received a Hubert Humphrey Fellowship from the U.S. Department of State in 2002 and spent a year at Penn State University working on a research project on higher education policy in Turkmenistan. Dr. Yazlieva will deliver her presentation titled Autocracy in Turkmenistan and the Role of Media in Cultivating Personality Cult. Having introduced the panelists, as a reminder, we do the Q&A session after the completion of the presentations. There, our respected participants can write their questions in the chat box or by raising their virtual hand and pose their questions in person. Now, I would like to leave you with Professor David Lewis, who will present an overall view on populist authoritarianism across Central Asia and who will administer the panel. Professor Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for the invitation today. It's great to see such an interesting panel and such an interesting topic arising. I think it's very important that we start to discuss authoritarian systems across the world within this broader comparative framing. And I think adding in populism to that mix is really very intellectually stimulating and a useful way to approach these questions. I've been doing research in different ways on Central Asia over more than 2 decades. When I first went there, I worked for the International Crisis Group, part of what you might call a kind of liberal establishment, working across the globe to promote various types of liberal values, and working at that time on conflict prevention in particular. But I think what's interesting is to think about how the discourses have changed over 2 decades in relation to the concept of authoritarianism, the concept of democracy, and also towards liberal values, something slightly different, of course. And that, some of the big differences are that at that time, in the early 21st century, there was only really one game in town, that was liberal democracy. We were still living through the Fukuyama end of history. Broadly speaking, the global discourse, if you like, was fairly flat. There was broad consensus on what the future political systems would look like. And I think what we've seen is increasing challenges to that discourse, lots more both legitimate and illegitimate, I suppose, challenges to it, and lots more nuance, I would say, around the concept of authoritarianism and indeed around democracy too. And it's worked in different ways. One has been obviously the rise of populism among Western democracies. We've seen challenges to liberal democracy in its homeland, if you like, in the West, but also I think in Central Asia and across these wider regions, a more complex understanding of what these political systems do, and perhaps even a more nuanced understanding that moves us on from this very almost simplistic binary between democracy and autocracy on the other hand. And within that, I suppose the concept of populism is one that might help us in some ways. When I was working in Kyrgyzstan quite a lot during the sort of 2000s, that was the time when populism was always identified with revolutionary movements, with upheaval, with politics from below. But I think it's also worth thinking about how populism has fed into regime politics, into the politics of authoritarianism from above. And that's been a slow process, I think, in Central Asia, but one that I think we might see some reflection on from the panelists going forward. I think there's also been a shift in international attitudes and international context here. Obviously, there's always been a conditionality to sort of political engagement with Central Asia from the outside world, and particularly from Europe and North America. And those conditions, if you like, have usually been linked to some kind of geopolitical processes. In the 2000s, it was the war in Afghanistan, post 9/11 movement, which certainly tempered criticism towards authoritarian states and created opportunities for local leaders to hedge one power against another. And now, of course, we see a similar situation in relation to Russia. Again, a geopolitical card that regimes in the region can play. Again, part of this multi-vector foreign policy. So there's never been a very clear strategy, really, from the outside powers towards the promotion of democracy in the region. And I think what we've seen has always been this contextualization of Central Asia within a much wider context, and often a failure to engage with Central Asian states in terms of their own challenges and their own domestic issues. I hope some of our panelists will look at is a much more engaged attitude to understanding what an authoritarian regime is, and that there are many more aspects to it than simply what you might call old-fashioned authoritarianism. There are informal economics, there are clan politics, there are complex relations between different political groupings, there are regional politics. In other words, politics still lives on in authoritarian political systems, even if the elections that take place regularly are not necessarily the place where political disputes are fought over. So I think understanding the power politics of political systems, even those that are not democratic, has been something that increasingly political scientists have become rather good at. But I think there's still a lot of work to do there. And that's where I think the research of certainly a new generation of political scientists in Central Asia is really illuminating how these systems work, and not just focusing on repression, as perhaps was a typical approach from older school approaches to authoritarianism, but looking at media, looking at messaging, looking at narratives, looking at political spin, looking at economic governance and the cooptation of elites in different ways, and of course a strong emphasis on, in some areas at least, on nationalism and in that context, a certain amount of populism as well. So I think what we are looking at now is a new generation of research on Central Asia, and today is a kind of window onto that research from some of the leading scholars on Central Asia, and I think it's excellent to see this much more, if you like, complex approach to understanding political systems that's emerging within the literature over the last few years. So I'm going to stop there and start to bring in our distinguished panelists. And we're going to start with Oksana Izmailbekova, and each panelist will talk for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will take questions at the end of all the presentations so that we can have a good discussion. Thank you. Oksana.
Thank you. I would immediately start sharing my presentation. Do you hear me well?
Yes, you can hear you very well.
Okay, good. Wait, I will start from here. Okay, so my title of my project has changed a little bit. It's on Native Son, Embodiment of Injustice in Kyrgyzstan. And as we know from our previous research, that Kyrgyzstan has experienced 3 revolutions, and in 2005, 10, and 20. And in all these revolutions, people were dissatisfied with the government. They were against formal governance and corruption. They were dissatisfied with the fraud elections or extensive vote buying and intimidation. And the last one was because of mismanagement during the COVID pandemic in 2020. And as a result of corruption, as a result of October Revolution in 2020, a new president came, this time Japarov, and the previous president, Jeenbekov, was overthrown on October 15, 2020, and since during this protest in October 2020, there were a lot of political prisoners were released, including the current president of Kyrgyzstan, Japarov. And Japarov became using this revolutionary favor into his hand quickly, taking this situation into his hand quickly. He became the acting president and prime minister. And the current president, he started to criticize earlier political leaders for being corrupt, nepotism, links to criminality, mismanagement of COVID-19. And he instead promised that he would bring justice and claimed to care for his people. And of course, the progressive movement, progressive forces, they accused Japarov of undermining democracy by bribery, reinforcing authoritarian rule, setting up connection with to the criminal world. And however, Japarov, he started to take power into his hands quickly. So he first relied on old elites by providing the key positions, especially he could find alliances with the opposition leaders. He amended the constitution within a short period of time to increase his presidential power. He restricted the freedom of mass media. At the moment, he is also restricting the social media, including TikTok. And he took judiciary into his hand, and he took the direct responsibility for foreign and domestic policy. So foreign experts appear puzzled by Japarov's continued kind of apparent popularity and success as a man of the people. And I would call Japarov as a native son, a simple man wearing several hats at the same time. And he's proposing this authoritarian power. Yet his political qualification is always questioned. But at the same time, he's given the right to govern and seen as a legitimate ruler, mainly because of his personal suffering. So I approach my presentation that he could mobilize mass support, playing kind of emotions. He's successful, especially using his personal suffering and using rhetoric and strategies of kinship. So as a result, many Kyrgyz or citizens identify with him. All his tragic stories that I will describe in the following slides. And now, if we Google about especially Japarov, we will see a lot of interesting titles with regard to Japarov. Like in international media sources, what we see that there are different from prison to presidency, Japarov's victory. So, and a lot of kind of questions arise why he became very popular, despite the fact that he still violates a lot of rule of law. And now I would like to start from his arrest. Arrest of Japarov. Citizens still identify with Japarov because state punished him in several ways. And his life was difficult. And he for example, in 2013, he organized a protest in nationalizing gold company Kumter, and by claiming that land's gold belonged to people. And state opened a criminal case against him, and as a result, he was forced to leave the country. And he always says in his speeches that what he knows what it means to live in a foreign country by taking the heart of millions of migrants living in Russia, for example. And he's quite good in coming back to his personal history. When it comes to, for example, during the elections, he could mobilize migrants as well. And now I would like to talk about how he became the embodiment of injustice in Kyrgyzstan, how his suffering really make him very respectful for, in the opinion of people. For example, he attempted suicide in order to make his case kind of public, and he claimed that he made or attempted to make this suicide in order to find justice in this unjust, corrupt, dependent court system, and people attach their personal experience with him. And another thing, here, for example, many identify with Japarov because of his human emotional suffering. For example, when he was in prison, he lost his son and parents, and the state didn't allow him to attend their funeral. And this was something that citizens would not forgive the state, because, and this injustice, this poverty, state betrayal, and insensitivity over the loss of father and children. He uses all his kind of tragic biography when he approached to people, and of course people perceive him as more like themselves than by other candidates. A suffering person experience that others value and respect, and people would always claim that he know with his skin what it means to live in an unjust kind of court system, for example. And so as a result, what we see is that his suffering, this emotional suffering, has been used widely, and this has been translated quite well as a political capital during the elections, and suffering has been cultivated necessary virtue and judgment, being in the future as a good president. Unlike others who continuously disappoint and exhaust the population, Japarov's suffering makes him worthy of citizens, and this he could play quite well with this card. For example, he organized a huge performance by claiming that he came when there was a hopeless situation. He became the hope of the nation, and he claims that he is the hope in a failed democracy, and he could be the source of justice because of his suffering at the hands of the state. And this has been well performed to lots of constituents of Japarov. And this is my favorite part, because this part is interesting in many ways. Once he became the president, a lot of historians started to search for his ancestors by claiming that he has legitimate right to lead the Kyrgyzstan by going to archives and going deep, trying to see where his descendants, where his ancestors, who are they, and which ancestor he is descended. And they claim that Japarov is direct descendant of Hans, rulers of Central Asia, by going to Russian, Arabic scripts, and by claiming that their great fathers back to 7th generation, they used to, especially Japarov's ancestor, used to command great authority and search for justice. So these historians claim that this search for justice is in his blood, considering the fact that kinship is very important for Kyrgyz, is part of identity and relatedness. And this was another move that historians also played a crucial role, especially making him very kind of legitimate kind of leader, as if this search for justice is in his blood. And another thing, there are a lot of interesting videos in YouTube who are the ancestors of Japarov, where different kind of historians argue, discuss, debate about his genealogy, about his lineages, and it's very interesting to observe and how they go depth into this. His lineage comes from Bogo. Another important aspect, as I have said in my presentation, that Japarov has a lot of hats, so he can wear different hats depending on the situation. So here, when he went to the southern part of Kyrgyzstan, he decided that he decided to wear the Razakov's hat. He used to be the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Kyrgyzstan. So Razakov's hat, Japarov identified his fate, political goal, and mission with Razakov. And he talked to his villagers, Razakovs, and distant relatives by claiming that he's the one who would continue the mission that Razakov left. So in a way, he's seeing his continuation with Razakov as well. So, and of course, he could mobilize quite well his villagers by using this lineage, kinship, genealogy, and this idea of that he is descendant from the ancestors that kept constantly searching for justice. So as if it is in his blood. So he promised, and so far this has been quite successful in terms of him being very popular, and even till now we can see how people are still obsessed with Japarov, and he knows the language, how to speak with the local people, and the way how he speaks Kyrgyz language is really good. Especially he knows he is capable of looking this entering the cultural intimacy of people. Speaking simple languages and making sure that their voices are heard. And yeah, and I will stop here, and we can discuss further. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's absolutely fascinating. And I think we'll come back to lots of those themes about this identification with a leader, so typical of populism, question of language. I thought, again, really interesting, and this question of lineage, this history of charismatic leadership, which again is very interesting. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, and we move countries a little bit as well, so from Kyrgyzstan to Kazakhstan. So Denisa Divanova is going to present on autocracies past and present in Kazakhstan. Denisa.
Thank you. Thank you for having me at this session. I'm going to share my presentation now. So let me figure out how to go to the full screen very quickly. All right. So with the case of Kazakhstan, the link between the autocratic nature of the political regime and populism is much more tenuous comparing to Japarov's case. So let me first establish what are the possible sort of reasons why we might see Kazakhstan pivoting to this populist style of political rule. So if we look at what happened in the country after the January 2022 protests, when President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev went on a Zoom call addressing the joint session of the Senate and Majlis, and seemingly sort of called on this sort of agenda reigning on the power of the powerful elites and redistributing the spoils of their rule to the people. So there is a quote from his January 11th of 2022 speech, where he says that a group of powerful, profitable companies emerged in the country. He also mentioned wealthy individuals, at that point not by name, And he said, quoting, "I think it's time they pay their dues to the people of Kazakhstan." Tokayev called for establishing a national fund for collecting such debts and redistributing them back to the people. So this is sort of one possible connection one might sort of see between Kazakhstan and the populist pivot. We can also see that it wasn't, at least on the surface, just the lip service to the popular calls, to the popular sentiment. He did follow through by arranging the imprisonments and trials of the elite leaders who were behind the January 2022 protests. And also their assets were seized. So assets of those leaders and their associates were seized. You know, we can debate how much of those assets were seized. Maybe with Karim Masimas, we're talking about significant amount of assets. However, when it comes to the member of Nazarbayev's family, Kairat Satibalde, maybe you know, his net worth is estimated as at 160-some $1 million, and only $1.5 million was seized from him. So, so this is a possible populist connection. My research, which sort of appeared in the last year book, this is the cover of the book, Fifth Opportunists and Autocrats, where I argued that in fact, what we see emerging in Kazakhstan, as well as a number of other Eurasian autocracies, is strengthening an institutionalization of authoritarian states and very effective state building exercise that resulted in more agile and more sort of capable state. And the mechanism that the autocrats had figured out how to balance the conflicting elite and mass interests might in fact account for the seeming populist turn that we observe in 2022. So in fact, I would argue that what we see with this quote unquote populist pivot of Tokayev is just another iteration of the formula for maintaining stable autocratic power that was invented and perfected during Nazarbayev's times, and this is just more recent iteration of that. So my explanation.
Anita, sorry, could I just?
Yeah.
Were you using slides? Because I can only see the first slide if you had more than one slide.
Oh, let me
Sorry,
see.
just to make sure.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. That's better. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right. So unfortunately, my full screen does not change slides for you. All right. So in my research, I focus on something that I call the regulatory authoritarian state. So this is the type of institutional arrangement that the Eurasian autocrats had perfected over the course of their post-Soviet period. So how do they build those autocratic regulatory states? Basically, I argue that one way to think about the task for the state building autocrats is the following. They need to balance the demands of the particularistic demands of the elites, who are essential in supporting the authoritarian rule in the face of potential popular challenge. But they also need to balance the elites' demands with the promotion of collective goods. One way to think about it is think about sort of those kleptocratic autocrats presiding over an economic pie. And if they completely neglect the task of providing collective goods, this pie will be shrinking and there will be intensified competition for the economic rents that they need to divide with the elites. So they do need to invest in good economic performance, which essentially is what people want, which those are the things that benefit the national economies. So I also wanted to sort of one of the interesting connection to this this balancing act actually appears in Tokaev's January 11th, 2022 speech, where he says, where he quotes a famous saying, the famous slogan that in 1930s sort of was attributed to Latin American politician Oscar Benavides, who said, "For my friends and everything, for my enemies the law." And this is essentially really a good summary of how Kazakh autocracy had balanced this dilemma, and how the Kazakh autocracy had ruled in the past and the present. So how do those autocrats build the regulatory states? And more specifically, essentially, the question is, when do autocrats reign on corruption, bureaucratic abuse, and preferential treatment of elites, and prioritize good economic performance? So from the autocrat's dilemma, we can see that whenever sort of the regime stability is predicated on the popular support, there will be a need to rebalance the focus towards providing collective goods, towards satisfying the needs of the general population, and away from the elites' sort of interest, from building, from rewarding elites' loyalty with giveaways to special interests. Also, another reason to think why autocrats might rebalance their attention towards sort of streamlining their economic policy, improving the conditions for the economy and in general for the population, is when there is a threat that the overall sort of size of economic pie is going to shrink. So when they have fewer resources, it becomes more important to provide good conditions for sort of endogenous economic growth, so they can skim the spoils. And from that sort of theoretical expectations, I have empirical expectations that I examined in my recent book. So popular protests, and we can think about the January 2022 events as being a good illustration for this type of logic. So popular protests usually sort of would indicate the need for streamlining, for building more capable, effective, and responsive state institutions. So, so this is one empirical expectation. And another empirical expectation is that when the autocrats face a declining resources, when there are fewer resources in state coffers, they need to sort of streamline the government apparatus. They need to rain down on bureaucratic graft, abuse of office, corruption, and preferential treatment of the powerful elites. So with those two empirical expectations, one way to think about what was going on in 2022 is you have the popular unrest that prompts the seeming seeming populist pivot by President Tokayev. And then with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, you have sort of rising streams of resource wealth with the rising oil prices, energy prices worldwide. Kazakh authorities get access to increasing resources that they can use in order to pacify popular demands without really raining down on bureaucratic abuse. So we have those two conflicting sort of forces here that in fact prevented more sort of more forceful pivot towards what one might call populism in Kazakhstan, right? So we have a promise, we have some symbolic results, and yet we do not see sort of radical changes when it comes to sort of fight against corruption and reorienting the state institutions towards providing the public good. So so some of those dynamics have been explored in quantitative research in my book, where I look at the formal indicators of the constraint on the abusive discretionary power of state agencies. So I reason that if you have formal institutions, formal mechanisms that constrain what the state agencies can do, they will behave in a more predictable and more accountable manner. And this is the graph that shows the over time growth in the amount of those formal regulatory constraints on the bureaucracies. And you can see that starting from 2005, 2007, there had been a rapid expansion in that formal regulatory constraints on the actions of the state institutions, state administrative institutions, and much of it is driven by the ministerial orders, right? So it's really, so the ministries down from the ministerial level down to the sort of execution by the street level bureaucrats. This is where we see improvement in the overall capacity and quality of government administration. And we don't see corresponding increase in the institutions that sit above the ministerial hierarchy. So those data come from a public source. It's the Republican Center for Legal Information. And I have the complete data series going up to the end of 2018, basically through the Nazarbayev's term. And what I find in my analysis that this mechanism of going back and forth between increasing the formal oversight mechanisms over state bureaucrats and giving them more power in interpreting the regulatory state policy, going back and forth, really corresponds to the fluctuation in oil revenues that Kazakhstan receives. So I evaluate using those data. I evaluate the following hypothesis in my book: in times of economic difficulties and shrinking state resources, politicians will be constraining bureaucratic discretion in regulatory policy application. And I don't want to this is how the data that I analyze look like. So the thick line represents the amount of oil rents that go to the state coffers, and the the lines, the dashed lines represent different kinds of regulatory documents that restrict the power of state agencies. I analyzed economic and social regulations, and I analyzed different types of economic regulations in my research. I also use, those are by different sort of authorities. On this graph, the legislative constraints, the legislative statutes are actually graphed on a different axis. There are much fewer legislative constraints. Legislature had not been the major force of constraining the actions of the state institutions in Kazakhstan. But for the sake of showing how it fluctuated over time, I show that graph. And I have the results from the time series regression that regresses the amount of oil rents. I'm sorry, that regresses the amount of oil rents on the number and the overall detail measured in the length, in the total length of those documents across different categories of regulations. And I see that for the most of them, the declining oil rents actually increase that sort of regulatory oversight. So when the rents decline the following year or the 2 years down the road, we see an expansion in regulatory detail, in the formal regulatory detail in laws and bylaws in Kazakhstan, and vice versa. When the rents go up, when the rents shrink, we see. When the rents increase, we see decline in those details. So let me go quickly to the conclusions. And those conclusions, I did not really talk much about, I did not document the evidence of high capacity autocracy in Kazakhstan, but, we can quickly reference, the ratings of regulatory quality and state capacity. And Kazakhstan has emerged as a strong, very capable, and they're well-governed autocracy at this point. And this is very interesting because this increase in state capacity that is documented by the World Bank and the World Economic Forum and the other international institutions actually goes hand in hand with systemic corruption, cronyism, and favoritism towards the regime associates. The state, over the course of its independent history, had become increasingly formalistic and had used regulations heavy-handedly in order to manage economic activity of the private sector. Yet those regulations are far from unbiased towards private interests. We do see a pattern of this going back between discretion and constraint when it comes to the state bureaucracy that implements the autocrats' policies. And so I see this as a really good mechanism for the autocrats to balance the demands for rent redistribution, which happens when those state institutions receive a lot of discretion in interpreting their tasks and interpreting the nature of state policy in economic and social sphere, and when that discretion is curtailed, they are forced to implement the state policy in the way the autocrats formulated. So when oil revenues decline, and this is what I talked about with those empirical results, more specific regulations are adopted to curtail bureaucratic opportunism. So very quickly, Takayev's liberalization, the signs of this liberalization under Kassym-Jomart Tokayev can also be interpreted as the rise of digital authoritarianism. So one of the major accomplishments is growing digitalization of state services, and that digitalization really increased state capacity and efficiency. We do see a continuing use of those formal regulatory mechanisms at the level of policy formulation. Those regulatory documents become more detailed, or they're withdrawn. So that is those mechanisms are quite efficient today in pursuing the policy objectives. When it comes to something that would be indicative of a use of different mechanisms to balance the needs of different constituencies, there isn't really much evidence of reliance on transparency, public accountability, and oversight because there continues to be restrictions on the freedom of press, and there is a continuing sort of indication that judiciary is far from independent in the country. So this is where I will stop. I'm looking forward for the questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Denisa. That was fascinating. Really interesting, these balances and balancing acts of governments and how they're trying to increase state efficiency while not changing the broader political system. So we'll come back to lots of those questions, I think. We will now move on to, I think, to Oguljamal Yazlieva, because I think our other participant is not here at the moment. Is that right? Dan Kudabaganova. Let's move on a little bit, and Oguljamal Yazlieva is going to talk to us for 15 minutes, I think, on primarily on Turkmenistan, if I understand correctly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for having me in today's session. Let me share my screen. So, thank you again, and I will present today the topic about Turkmenistan's autocratic system and the role of media in cultivating personality cult. I will talk about, in general, about Turkmenistan's overview about Turkmenistan and theoretical concepts and methodology that I use in my research, in particular in this presentation. Political culture developed in independent Turkmenistan after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and I will talk about nation-building narratives using some examples, and then I will switch to cult of personality of state leaders. So we will talk about the meaning of this concept and self-legitimation strategies that the autocratic political elite uses in their policies. And then we will talk about media's central position in building the cult of personality. And I will conclude with the research findings. So Turkmenistan is one of the 5 republics in Central Asia, which is the most isolated in the region. And the isolation policy started in the early period of its independence under the leadership of the first president of Turkmenistan, independent Turkmenistan, Saparmurat Niyazov. As it is isolated, it is hard to get some statistics about. Even I here put some different statistics about the population. You cannot rely on the statistics that provided by the government authorities. The government type is presidential republic, but it is known as autocratic regime. In this,
Sorry, could I just check if you are you sharing your screen, Oguljamal? Because
yes,
I can't see it. I don't know if
you cannot see.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to try sharing again just to make sure we can see it?
Let me. I'm sorry. Let me. Screen sharing. I cannot see there.
Should see the bottom button at the bottom. Green button. I have a green button.
Yes. Sorry for that. And so this one. Okay.
Yep, if you click on slideshow, I think you will get the
I
full.
cannot see.
Can you see slideshow? I think that would probably work.
So, do you see the slides?
Yes, they're quite small, but
Mm,
if you can go, yeah, click on slideshow.
I cannot see. Okay, now here.
Yeah, that's right.
Slideshow, and here's it.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's great.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
Now, so this is the outline I've mentioned about, and the concepts that I use in my research. Existing studies on the political system of Turkmenistan attribute a crucial role to the phenomenon of the cult of personality in promoting national ideology in the country's state-building process during the transition period. In this process, the media plays a crucial role. Consequently, in my research, I consider the relationship between media and politics in Turkmenistan and utilize the theoretical framework of authoritarian political culture and personalist regime, one-man rule, as well as the authoritarian theory of the press. As I mentioned before, we will talk more about the media's role in strengthening and consolidating the authoritarian regime in this country. The study of this relationship covers media control mechanisms and the behavior of the Turkmen state leadership, which played a crucial role in the emergence and development of the suppressed media system. The media system developed under the institution of leadership in Turkmen, Serdarçılık, in Turkmen society can be considered as a unique model of political culture of Turkmen society. Moreover, this model, based on the concept of authoritarianism and one-man rule, plays an important role in building the cult of personality around the first president of independent Turkmenistan, Saparmurat Niyazov, and developed by the government of Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, Niyazov's successor, and his son, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov's son, that Serdar Berdimuhamedov, that rules the country currently. The national development model that is used in the political system of Turkmenistan may be explained with the process of recycling the Soviet system, the communist regime, of authoritarian control and historical tribal lifestyle. As you may noticed at the first slide, I put the flag of Turkmenistan where there are 5 patterns of the carpet of Turkmenistan, which is very which is used by the government, authoritarian government, to show to legitimize their rules, to legitimize their power, giving the patterns of the carpet that belong to each provinces of Turkmenistan. 5 patterns of the carpet corresponds 5 provinces of Turkmenistan, which means that tradition, the tribal history of the Turkmen people plays a role in developing the political system, authoritarian system in this country. So recycling the Soviet system and using the historical tribal traditions is very important to understand the current situation, the current political rules in this country. And at the very beginning of the independence of Turkmenistan, the first president of Turkmenistan, Sapar Murat Niyazov, mentioned this tradition, the historical tradition of, he promised, first of all, to develop the country towards democracy, but he mentioned that, he underlined that it will be step by step, regularly, which means that he underlined that every aspect of life will be under the control of the state, including the media system. And in his address to Halk Maslahati, the People's Council, he underlined that media will be under control. And this promise was functioning alongside of more than 30 years in the system of in the political system of Turkmenistan. So the media system is under strict control of the government. Here I would like to mention again the media's role to consolidate the power, autocratic power. The political leadership, political elite uses all channels of media, including TV, including radio channels, print media, and internet. Here I would like to show the next slide where I share two parts about the consumption of media in Turkmenistan. Here in the first one, media platform choices of the respondents. By the way, I could manage to survey using different platforms of social media with Turkmenistani people and some email contacts of the people, and gathered around 60 respondents during 2 months of survey process. And here, if you can see, TV still plays a role, and the authoritarian government uses TV as a major platform to provide the information about the policy of the government. And among all platforms, more than 25% belongs to TV. And it is very important to mention about the language choices of media consumption among respondents. Here in the second part, you can see the Russian language is the biggest number. More than 50% of the respondents chooses the Russian language platforms in the country. And therefore, we now witness the propaganda of the Turkmen, not only of the Turkmen government, but the Russia's propaganda machine is always very influential in the country. So using these platforms by the authoritarian government, the message to the population targeted to the Turkmen population, if you compare the content of different platforms. Let's say the TV case. They broadcast in mainly in the Turkmen language, but they have some channels in Russian and in other foreign languages. But the policy of the government is targeted to the Turkmen-speaking population in the country, and the glorification of the personality of the state leaders are provided in the Turkmen language using some specific epithets, glorifying the first leader, the first man in the government, the president, using some epithets, cliches, phrases like milletin atası başındık olsun, father of the nation, be healthy, and so on and so forth. And it is very important to mention here that during broadcast of news stories or feature stories on TV, these epithets, these cliches should be repeated several times. For example, in my content analysis of the reports about, let's say, sport event, in 1 minute report of the sport event in Turkmenistan, the reporter should mention several times, 6, 10 times, the glorification of the first leader of the government, the president. And if, in general, if we talk about the media landscape of Turkmenistan, the literature, the academic literature, it is very little coverage about the media system in academic literature, but we have some very interesting arguments about the media system, which is attributed it as repression, propaganda, and suppression. All media channels, which is unique in Turkmenistan, all media channels are under state control. There is only one platform which is considered private, but it was launched under the leadership of the government, and it is also under strict control of the government officials. So the Constitution of Turkmenistan reads no censorship, the freedom of speech is provided, but in reality we see that all media channels are under control, including the internet, which is now developing in the country, but it is strictly controlled by the government authorities.
Dr. Yazlieva, would you be able to come towards your conclusions as we want to get to the
so
question?
here in this slide, I would like to show the models, how they use the media in order to keep to create fear in the society. For example, this slide, Vatan Havarları slide taken from screenshot from TV, shows in big picture the wrongdoings and the final result, the imprisonment of those people who are not in line with the government policy. Or here in this picture, you can see the glorification of the president of Turkmenistan in all periods under the first president and the others. And here in two pictures, you can see very interesting phenomenon in Turkmen society broadcast on TV, kissing hands of the first leader or bowing before the first leader, providing some, which is not in line with the tradition of the Turkmen people. And in conclusion, I would like to mention that the authoritarian political culture takes its roots from the historical tribal conditions and the Soviet communist regime and regime's authoritarian control. And the idiosyncratic personality cult that I showed you in the previous slide, the pictures, how they use the TV, and the key role of the personality of the state leader in the Turkmen society is always promoted by glorifying the first leaders on different platforms of the media. And to consolidate this authoritarian regime, we see the participation of not only the authoritarian political elite by the ordinary people. They accept this condition because traditionally they respect their fathers, the family, kinship, traditions, tribal, and they used to live in that system. Therefore, they accept this system, glorifying the first leader, and therefore the authoritarian political culture is consolidated with the support not only by the political elite, by the common population of the Turkmen society. And in this situation, alternative media is very necessary in order to influence somehow to the minds of the people, in order to provide the alternative news and information about Turkmenistan and from the other countries of the world. Now I will stop here. Thank you for your attention, and we can continue our discussion during our question session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Yazlieva. That was absolutely fascinating and a reminder of the importance of discourse, messaging, narratives, media in maintaining these political systems. So we have plenty of time for questions and answers, and there's lots of very interesting aspects to pick up there. So I have quite a few questions that I would like to